Montana Territory, April 1881. The wind came sharp off the flats, dust curling across the hard-packed street of Red Rock Junction. Just as Marshal Merritt Hale stepped out of the saloon and saw her barefoot, dirt on her hem, arms cradling a bundle so tightly it looked like she was trying to hold the world together with nothing but her body. She stood outside the general store, her voice breaking as she spoke to the shopkeeper. "Please, just a little milk. He has not eaten since yesterday. I will work, I will clean, anything." The shopkeeper shook his head, not cruel but unmoved. "Ain't got it to spare, miss." "That baby looks near a year. He needs more than milk." Marshal Hale stepped off the boardwalk and crossed the street in 5 strides. "Is there a problem here?" His voice was calm, but it carried. The woman turned quick, eyes wide, frightened. Her face was thin, her cheeks hollowed like a woman who had not eaten much herself, but she held the baby like he was the only thing keeping her alive. "No problem," the shopkeeper muttered. "She was just leaving." "I was not," she started, but her voice cracked. "Ma'am," Merritt said, looking at her, not the shopkeeper. "You and your boy hungry?" She hesitated, then gave a small nod. "What is his name?" She looked down at the baby in her arms. "Zeke, he is 10 months." Merritt looked back at the shopkeeper. "Put together a bottle of milk. And some bread, dried meat, apples if you have them." The shopkeeper blinked. "Marshal, I will cover it." The woman was still staring at him like she could not quite believe he was real. Her lips parted, but nothing came out. He took off his hat, ran a hand through his hair, then looked her in the eye. "You will never have to beg again. Do you understand me?" She blinked, tears suddenly slipping down her cheeks. She nodded. He reached into his coat and pulled out his coin pouch. "Give her enough supplies for 3 days. I will be back before then." He turned to her. "Come on, you and Zeke are coming with me." She hesitated. "Why?" "Because I have a horse and a warm fire, and I do not leave women and babies out on the street." He paused. "What is your name?" "Calla." "Calla North." "Well, Miss North," he said, quiet but firm, "you and your boy are safe now." She followed him, unsure, but with Zeke held tight to her chest and a sliver of something fragile in her eyes, hope maybe. Merritt helped her up into the saddle first, then handed Zeke up to her before swinging into place behind. His horse, Dusty, made the short ride to his cabin on the edge of town without protest. Inside, the fire was going, the place neat but sparse. He set about boiling water, pulling bread and jerky from a tin, grabbing a clean cloth to wrap Zeke in. Calla moved slowly, like someone used to waiting for permission. "Sit," he said softly. "You are allowed to rest." "I do not know how to thank you," she whispered as she fed the baby, her voice cracking again. "You do not have to," he said. "Just take care of him." She glanced at him, brow furrowed. "Why are you doing this?" Merritt shrugged. "Same reason I wear a badge. Someone has to do right by folks." She watched him. "Most men do not stop when they see a woman begging." "I am not most men." She looked away, but he saw her lips twitch, just barely, a flicker of something warm. He gave her space, tending to the fire, setting out food. A quiet settled between them, not awkward, just still. The kind of quiet that comes when something has shifted and both people know it. Later, after Zeke had fallen asleep on a folded blanket by the hearth, Calla stood near the fire, arms crossed, but her shoulders finally loose. "I came up from Kansas," she said, voice low. "My husband died last winter, fever, we had nothing. I tried to get work, but no one wants a widow with a baby. I walked for 2 days to get here." "You should not have had to." She looked at him then, really looked. "You are not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "Someone who would take one look and ride on." He studied her. "I saw a mother doing everything she could to keep her boy alive. That is not something I could ignore." She swallowed, eyes shining. "I did not think anyone would help." "Well, you were wrong about that." He stepped closer. "You are not alone anymore." She stared at him, and something in her face softened. "You mean that?" "I do." Zeke stirred in his blanket. Calla moved to kneel beside him, brushing his cheek with her fingers. Merritt watched her, the way she looked at her son like he was made of glass and gold. "You are welcome to stay here until you find your footing," he said. "No strings." She looked up at him, voice barely a whisper. "I think I would like that," Merritt nodded. "I will sleep in the barn if it makes you more comfortable." "No," she stood, brushing her skirt. "You should sleep in your own bed. I will take the chair." "You will not. You will take the bed." I will take the chair. They stared at each other for a long moment, then she smiled, just a little. All right, Marshal, just Merritt, all right, Merritt. He watched her with Zeke, the way she smiled at him when she thought no one was watching. He felt something stir in his chest, quiet but certain. He had not meant to find anyone. He had not thought about love in years. But now, with this woman in his home and her baby sleeping near his fire, something had changed, and he knew, deep down, he did not want her to leave. By the second morning, the frost had lifted from the windows, leaving streaks of melt that caught the sunlight in crooked, glinting lines. Merritt rose early, as he always did, and stepped outside to split wood. The quiet came thick with bird call, the kind that only returned once winter had loosened its grip. Each crack of the axe echoed across the yard, steady and sure. Inside the cabin, Calla stirred. She didn't open the door until Zeke had finished nursing, his small hands curled against her blouse like he was afraid she might disappear. She stepped out with him balanced on her hip, wrapped in the same shawl she'd arrived in. Her eyes were clearer now, less guarded. "You sleep?" Merritt asked without looking up. "A little," she said. He woke once, then settled again. He nodded, setting another log in place. Calla shifted her weight. "You said you'd be back in town today." "I will." She hesitated, then said, "I want to come." Merritt paused mid-swing. "You sure?" "I need to show my face. Let folks see I'm not hiding." She looked down at Zeke. "And I need to learn what kind of work I can get." He lowered the axe. "You're not under obligation to work yet." Her jaw tightened. "I know that. But I'd rather earn what I can." Merritt studied her a moment, then nodded once. "All right, we'll ride in after breakfast." They ate on the porch, bread and dried pears and coffee for him, water and softened apple for her. Zeke gnawed on a strip of cloth that Merritt had boiled and cooled. He didn't fuss, just watched birds land on the fence rail with wide, quiet eyes. The ride into town was slow. Merritt let Dusty set his own pace, and Calla sat straight in the saddle, the boy pressed between them. Red Rock Junction came into view beneath the low morning sun, its buildings washed pale by the light. People stared. Not cruelly, but with the kind of curiosity that comes from small towns and new faces. Calla kept her chin up, gaze steady. Merritt dismounted first and helped her down, one hand steadying her as she stepped to the ground. "I'll head to the office," he said. "You can walk the town if you'd like, or you're welcome to wait inside." "I'd rather walk," she said. "He likes the air." She made her way along the boardwalk, stopping at the livery to ask about feed sacks. Then at the seamstress's window, where she stood watching a girl her own age thread a needle with careful movements. She didn't enter any shop, just watched, listened, let herself be seen. At midday, Merritt found her sitting on a bench beside the dry goods store, Zeke asleep across her lap. "You find anything?" She nodded. "The livery hand's wife just had a second babe. She's looking for someone to help with laundry and mending. I go tomorrow." Merritt sat beside her. "You sure you're ready for that?" Calla looked down at Zeke. "I wasn't ready to bury my husband either, but I did it." He looked away, jaw flexing. She turned to him. "You ever lose someone?" He nodded once. "Younger brother, shot in a cattle raid. I was 20. She didn't say she was sorry. Just reached out and adjusted Zeke's blanket. After a long moment, Merritt said, "I grew up near Miles City. My folks raised horses. I left home at 17, wound up wearing a badge 5 years later." She glanced at him. "You had someone before." He didn't answer right away. "Once. Long time back, she married a banker." Calla's gaze drifted to the horizon. "You still think about her?" "Not anymore." The wind picked up, brushing across the porch awning and lifting the edge of her skirt. She tucked it back with one hand, the other still resting on Zeke's back. "I never thought I'd end up here," she said, "but I'm not sorry I came." He looked at her, then at the baby. "Neither am I." They sat without speaking for a while until Zeke stirred and opened his eyes. Calla lifted him gently, pressing a kiss to his forehead. Merritt stood, offered her his hand. She took it without hesitation. That night, after supper, she stood by the hearth brushing her hair with a comb she'd found tucked in a drawer. Merritt sat at the table cleaning his rifle, the warm lamplight softening the lines of his face. Zeke was asleep again, this time swaddled in a worn quilt that had belonged to Merritt's mother. "I've been thinking," Calla said, eyes still on the fire. I'd like to help with the garden if you've got one. He looked up. I've got a patch, needs tending. She turned to face him. Then we'll tend it. He set the rifle aside. You and me, she gave the smallest nod. If that's all right. He stood slowly, crossed the floor between them. It is. Calla's hand brushed his as she reached to steady herself against the hearth. Neither pulled away. Outside, the moon rose full and quiet over the pines, casting long silver shadows across the yard. Inside, the fire burned low, and for the first time since she'd arrived, she let herself exhale. The ground softened by the week's end, and Merritt turned the soil in the garden while Calla knelt nearby, sleeves rolled to the elbow, planting onion sets with careful fingers. Zeke dozed wrapped in a flannel shawl, propped in a crate cushioned with old flour sacks. Each time a breeze stirred his dark curls, Calla glanced over, her hand pausing mid-motion before returning to the earth. Merritt straightened, wiping his brow with his sleeve. You worked land before. My father kept a patch behind the sod house, she said, pressing down the soil over a sprout. Mostly turnips and squash, didn't grow well in Kansas soil, but we tried. He nodded toward the edge of the yard. We'll build a fence next week, keep the elk out. She sat back on her heels. You always do things yourself, used to. Not sure I have to now. She didn't answer, but her gaze lingered a moment longer than it had the day before. By supper time, the wind turned cold again, and Merritt brought wood inside while Calla set a few biscuits on the hearthstone to warm. Zeke was babbling in her lap, fingers wrapped around a carved wooden spoon Merritt had whittled one winter long ago. He's been making that sound all afternoon, she said, lifting the child to her shoulder. Like he's trying to tell me something I'm too slow to understand. Maybe he's just glad to be fed and dry, Merritt said, setting the kettle on. I know I would be. Were you raised near kin? She asked. Just my folks and my brother, nearest neighbors were a day's ride. We made do, she shifted Zeke to her hip. I had 5 sisters. You couldn't sneeze without someone offering a cure for it. Her smile came and went quickly like it surprised her. Merritt poured water into 2 tin cups. You miss them? Every day, she said, quiet now. I haven't heard a word since the war ended. They stayed south. I don't know what's left. He handed her a cup, not pressing further. She took it with a nod and sat near the hearth, stretching her legs out. Zeke curled against her chest, his cheek pressed to her collarbone. Merritt watched the boys breathing slow, then turned back to the table. I've got something. She looked over, curious. He brought out a small muslin bundle and unwrapped it. Inside lay a pair of soft leather shoes clearly made for small feet. Found them in a trade box last fall. Meant to send them east to my cousin's little one, but they grew faster than I expected. Calla took them gently, thumb running along the stitching. You sure? He's got growing to do. Might as well do it with warm feet. She said nothing, but her hands trembled slightly as she eased them onto Zeke's feet. That night, the moon hung low and heavy, casting pale light through the window above the bed. Merritt sat in the chair, boots off, long legs stretched toward the fire. Calla stood by the window, arms folded, watching the trees sway in silence. I never meant to stay long, she said, voice low. I know, but this place. She glanced back, eyes unreadable. It doesn't feel like a stop anymore. Merritt didn't move. You don't owe me anything, Calla, she shook her head. It's not that, her throat worked. I've had to carry everything alone for so long, I forgot what it felt like to set something down. He rose then, slow and quiet, and crossed to her. He didn't touch her, just stood near enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence. You don't have to carry it alone anymore. Her gaze met his, steady despite the wetness at the corners of her eyes. You're not afraid of the weight, he shook his head once. I've been waiting to carry something that mattered. She reached for his hand, and this time she didn't let go. By the end of May, snowmelt ran fast through the coulee behind the cabin, and the first shoots of green pushed up from the garden rose. Merritt had added a second cot near the hearth for nights when Zeke fussed or Calla needed space to breathe. She'd taken to running her hands over the soil each morning before breakfast, as though reminding herself it was still there, still hers to tend. That morning she was quiet as she folded linens near the open window, her gaze slipping often toward the tree line. Merritt watched her from the porch step, a tin cup cooling in his palm. "What's on your mind?" She set the folded cloth aside and leaned against the sill. "There's a woman in town." "Mrs. Greeley." She asked if I'd come help her neighbor, Miss Rudd. "She's been ill since the freeze, can't keep up with her house." Merritt stood. "You want to go?" "I do." She twisted the hem of her apron. "It's a few miles out, but if I take Zeke and pack a meal, I could be back before dusk." He stepped inside, setting the cup on the table. "You trust her? She seems kind. Her husband died last spring, said she knows what it is to be watched like a stray dog." Merritt nodded. "If you go, I'll ride out after midday. Make sure you're safe getting home." Calla's mouth parted slightly. "You don't have to do that." "I know," she exhaled through her nose. "I'll leave after Zeke eats." He saddled Dusty in the afternoon and rode out toward the Rudd place once the sun had passed its peak. The land stretched wide and empty, the kind of quiet that pressed close. He found Calla near the well, bucket in hand, her sleeves damp and her cheeks pink from exertion. Zeke sat on a blanket in the shade of a bent cedar, gnawing on a wooden ring. She looked up when she heard the hooves and straightened. "You didn't need to come all the way." Merritt dismounted, tying Dusty to the fence. "Didn't sit right letting you walk home alone." Calla dipped her head toward the cabin. "Miss Rudd's resting. She didn't say a word all day. Just watched me scrub her floor like I was a ghost." He studied her face. "You all right?" She wiped her hands on her skirt. "I think so. It's strange, being useful again." He glanced at the house. "You think she'll ask you back?" She left a sack of flour on the table and said I could come every third day. Merritt nodded once. "That's something." They gathered Zeke and started the walk back down the trail, her basket swinging lightly at her side. The boy began to hum a low, tuneless sound that made Calla's mouth twitch. "He only does that when he's content," she said. Wind moved through the grass, bending it in slow waves. When the cabin came into view, Calla paused, her gaze lingering on the smoke trailing thinly from the chimney. "I never expected a place to feel like mine again." Merritt didn't answer right away. "Then you've made it yours." She looked down at the boy, then up at him. "Have you always lived alone?" He picked a stalk of grass and turned it between his fingers. "For a long time. I had a dog once. Named him Scout. He died 3 winters back." Her brow furrowed. "That must have been hard." It was quieter after. They walked the last stretch in silence. When they reached the porch, she turned to him. "Will you teach me to shoot?" He blinked. "Why?" "I don't want to be helpless again." "Not ever." Merritt studied her face, then gave a small nod. "We'll start tomorrow, after Zeke's fed." She went inside and he followed. He watched her lift her boy, press her lips to his temple, and carry him across the room with a steadiness that hadn't been there weeks ago. Later, as dusk fell and the last light caught the edge of her profile while she moved about the kitchen, Merritt stood in the doorway, arms folded. "I've seen a lot of things go wrong for good folks," he said. She looked over her shoulder. "And I'd like to see something go right." Calla didn't speak for a long moment. Then she dried her hands and crossed the room. She stopped in front of him and laid her palm gently against his chest, just above the badge he'd hung on the wall days earlier, where it didn't weigh him down. "I think it's starting to." The first shot Calla fired cracked through the still morning air, drawing a few startled birds from the trees. Merritt stood behind her, arms crossed, watching the smoke curl off the barrel of the old Colt he'd let her use. She adjusted her stance, lips pinched in concentration. "You leaned back at the last second," he said. "Keep the weight forward, trust your grip." She nodded, jaw set, and reloaded with careful hands. Zeke was wrapped snug on a quilt beneath the shade of a pine, a biscuit clutched in one fist and his eyes fixed on the movement of leaves overhead. Merritt had checked on him twice already. Calla had only looked over once. The second shot rang clearer and landed closer to the painted mark on the stump. She lowered the pistol and turned to him. "Better." "Much." She handed it back, flexing her fingers. "I don't want to use it, I just want the knowing." "You've got the start of it," he said. "We'll keep at it little by little." She nodded, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. "I'm not used to things coming slow. For so long, it was all at once: loss, fear, decision. Now it's like I'm learning to breathe in pieces." Merritt holstered the pistol. "Takes time." "But you're not doing it alone anymore." She looked at him then, not like she was searching for reassurance, but like she already knew it was true. He stepped forward and took her hand, rough fingers closing over hers with quiet certainty. She didn't pull away. That evening, she surprised him by asking to light the fire herself. He showed her how to nest the kindling, and she coaxed the flame to life with a patience she hadn't held weeks earlier. When it caught, she leaned back on her heels and glanced at him. "I used to be afraid of the dark," she said. "Not the night itself, just what it might bring. When it got quiet, I'd think of every bad thing that could come knocking." What changed? She looked around the room at the low cot where Zeke slept, the polished table, the shelves she'd wiped clean and filled with jars. "I stopped waiting for the knock." Later, after supper and the slow hush of rocking Zeke to sleep, she stepped out onto the porch. Merritt followed, shrugging into his coat. The stars were stretched wide above them, clearer than they'd been all spring. "I used to think if I started over, I'd have to forget what came before," she said. "But I don't want to forget him, my husband. He was kind, he'd have liked this place." Merritt's voice was low. "You don't have to forget to keep living." She turned toward him. "Would it bother you that I loved someone before?" "No," he met her eyes. "We've both lived through enough to know what love is worth. Yours doesn't take from mine." Her lips parted and she reached for his hand. "I didn't know I could feel this again. Not with someone who sees all of me." He stepped close, lifting her hand to his chest. "I see you every day more." And when he kissed her, it was quiet and sure like the rest of him. No rush, no question, just the slow settling of something long waited. They didn't speak much after that, just stood there, the two of them, until the lantern inside burned low and the crickets took over the silence. The days that followed unfolded steady. Merritt cleared a patch near the barn and built a pen for chickens. Calla traded mending for 6 hens from Miss Rudd, who had taken to sending over bread heels and dried elderberries without asking for anything in return. Zeke took his first halting steps between them in the yard, his laugh more certain than his balance. One afternoon, while Merritt was oiling the hinges on the shed door, Calla walked toward him with a folded paper in her hand. "It's from my sister," she said. "She's alive, they're all alive, living down near Abilene now." He wiped his hands and took the letter. "You gonna write back?" "I already did." She smiled. "Told her I'm safe, that I found a place and people." That evening, she cooked stew with wild onion and the last of the salt pork. They ate at the table with Zeke between them, his cheeks stained with broth and his eyes bright as candlelight. Afterward, Merritt pulled a small carved box from the shelf. "This was my mother's," he said. "She kept her sewing needles in it." Calla opened it slowly, revealing a plain silver band nestled on top of a folded scrap of blue calico. "I know it's not much," he said, "but I'd like you to wear it." "If you want to." She looked up, tears brimming but not falling. "You mean it." "I do." She slipped the ring onto her finger, then leaned forward and kissed him, long and warm, with her hand resting over his heart. They married under the cottonwoods behind the cabin with Mrs. Rudd and the Greeleys standing witness. Calla wore a dress she'd sewn herself, with lace stitched along the cuffs. Merritt shaved for the first time in weeks, and Zeke toddled through the grass with a wreath of wildflowers on his head, oblivious to the laughter around him. Summer came slow and golden. The garden flourished. Zeke learned to say Papa and dragged around a wooden horse Merritt carved him by lantern light. Calla spent mornings at the Rudd place and afternoons teaching herself to read from a weather-worn primer she'd found at the bottom of a trade box. One night, as the sun dipped low and the air turned soft with the scent of sage, Merritt sat beside her on the porch swing he'd built with his own hands. "You think this is it?" she asked, leaning into him. He wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "I think this is everything." They sat like that until the stars came out, the three of them wrapped in the hush of a life made, not stumbled into, and nothing ever came for them in the dark again.